Pay attention. Good. Good. 1, 2. All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here on a Monday night. We are actually celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. This band is 50 years old, and thank you very much. Some of these guys have been in the band almost that entire time. Some of them have come and gone at various times, but we're going to have a good time tonight, and we hope that you will too. That first tune is from the wonderful movie, The Pink Panther, the original Pink Panther movie, which came out in 1963. And the movie was set in Italy. And the wonderful composer Henry Mancini, who wrote so many great movie scores, he wrote the music, and then lyrics were added in Italian and English. And the Italian title is Meglio Stasera, which in English means Meglio Stasera. All right, thank you. You got the first jokes out of the way. No, it means it had better been tonight. And there's a great scene about the middle of the movie where they're in this kind of villa, and there's a whole crowd there, and I think I forget the woman, the actress who sang in the movie. It was Fran something, and I can't remember her last name. But she sings the tune, and then they kind of do this kind of little line dance at the end. It's really very cute. And this was probably inspired in some ways by the great samba and bossa nova craze of the early 1960s. Stan Getz, the great tenor saxophone player, and Charlie Bird, a wonderful jazz guitarist, put out an album in 1962 called Jazz Samba, and they really kind of put Brazilian samba and bossa nova into the jazz lexicon. And so that may have inspired the rhythm for that first piece. Now, our next piece is an interesting piece. It was actually written in 1912 and was first recorded in 1915, featuring Walter Van Brunt as the vocalist. I'm not sure who that was. I haven't found much about him. And the actor William Frawley, who played Fred Mertz on the original I Love Lucy show, claims to have been the first one to sing it in 1912 at a place called the Mozart Cafe in Denver, Colorado. Who knew? And this arrangement is by Joe Riposo, who is a wonderful jazz woodwind player and was the director of jazz studies at Syracuse University for many years. And this is not to be confused with Joe Raposo, R-A-P-O-S-A, who actually wrote a lot of music for Sesame Street. So this is a wonderful arrangement of My Melancholy Baby. Oh, thank you very much. How about another hand for Jeff Drew on tenor sax? And Mark Tucker on piano. The only problem with conducting and playing at the same time is that I have to shuffle music and try to do all that while I'm explaining things back here. You could tell, if you couldn't tell, I'll tell you, the first tune was a jazz samba, and that tune that we just played was, a traditional swing groove. And now we're going to go back to a Latin feel, and this is a piece written by the wonderful bebop trumpet player Dizzy Gillespie. And in 1946, he formed a big band in New York. He had been playing with Charlie Parker on the West Coast in 1945, and of course, well known that Charlie had some major drug problems, and of course, he still was an amazing player, but he fought that whole issue his entire life, and Dizzy wanted to get away from that. And so he moved back to New York and put together a full big band. And he hired Chano Pozo, who was a Cuban percussionist. And so that brought a new sound to the big band. And this piece, Manteca, is kind of considered the first jazz standard that is based on what we call a clave rhythm. Terry, would you demonstrate a clave, a 3/2 clave for us? Yeah. So what you hear on the rim of the snare drum there is what we call a clave rhythm. And did I lose? No, there we are. All right. And so this is, one of the first times that was introduced into jazz music, although earlier jazz composers had played around with this idea of a Latin style as far back as W.C. Handy in his famous piece, the St. Louis Blues. He had a verse, if you will, that was written as kind of a tango. So manteca is actually the Spanish word for lard. And of course, everyone knows that Dizzy was quite a cut-up. That's why he had a nickname, Dizzy. And although I didn't know this, but apparently manteca was also a slang term at the time for heroin. And of course, heroin was one of the big problems in the jazz world at that time, and the one that got Charlie Parker. Anyway, this is a wonderful arrangement by Mike Tamaro of Manteca by Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozo. Here we go. 1, 2, Okay, hope you enjoyed that. That's a lot of fun. That was a great Barry solo by Jeff Smith over here. How about a hand for Jeff? And a flute solo by my good buddy Steve Weichel right here. And just so you know, Steve is actually filling in. Steve played in this band many years ago, and our second alto player had a family trip that he couldn't get out of at the last minute, I found out. So Steve was nice enough to come in and cover for the last couple of rehearsals in this concert, and wonderful playing there. Mark Tucker again on piano. Jeff Drew again on the tenor sax. And Jim Bedrick on guitar. And yours truly on trumpet. Thank you. Now, let me explain something to you. Some of you seem to be rather timid about applauding after you hear somebody play an improvised solo. That is the rule. You have to applaud first. It doesn't matter how bad it is. That just shows us some love, and we actually play better when we know you're listening. So, don't be afraid to applaud after each and every solo. So we're going to return to the Pink Panther movie and play a great new arrangement of the theme song that you will all recognize. All right. You probably noticed that started in kind of a funky hip hop kind of beat, and then went into swing, and then went back to the funky beat again. All right, now we're going to do another great arrangement, and this one again is going to start out as a samba, and then you'll hear it switch to swing a little later on. So this was written by Rodgers and Hart, a very famous songwriting team that wrote a lot of wonderful musicals. And this is one that is probably lesser known, but apparently it was a pretty good hit when it came out in 1937. And it was a political satire of the time, and it actually featured another composer and actor, George M. Cohan, who played Franklin D. Roosevelt in the show. And the show was a success, ran for about 8 months. But this was the only real hit song from that show. Most shows have, 2 or 3 tunes that most people would remember from a show. And of course, Have You Met Miss Jones? Miss Jones was one of the characters, of course, in the show. And although this piece was performed by a handful of the well-known big bands in the 1940s, it didn't really catch on with jazz musicians till 1947, when the wonderful English pianist, bebop pianist George Shearing, had a recording of it in 1947, and then it started getting some attention from other jazz musicians. Now, one of the interesting features of this tune is that the bridge, that is the middle section, this is what we call an AABA form. The bridge, which is the B section, has an unusual chord progression in that it is 2-5-1 progressions in a couple of different keys, and it goes down by a major third. Now, interestingly enough, this is the same progression that the wonderful tenor saxophonist John Coltrane used in his famous tune Giant Steps. And you will hear later at the end of what we call a soli section, before we reprise the melody, you will hear a little quote of Giant Steps in the arrangement. So this is wonderful arrangement by Mike Tomorrow again. Have You Met Miss Jones? And actually, you'll see me play the flugelhorn this time. Mike, thank you, Aaron. So one of the challenges, of course, we don't really get a budget for music. So over the years, we actually have a fund. If you want to make a tax-deductible donation to the GPC Jazz Fund, you can do that through the Foundation of Georgia State University. And when you go on the website for giving, you just search GPC Jazz Fund and it will pop up. But that's how we buy music. And my dear sweet father, who passed away a couple of years ago, was one of the main benefactors of this band over the years. So I thought, well, one way around that is for me to start writing some more pieces. So that's what I decided to do. I've always wanted to write a slow blues, and so I did. Believe it or not, it only took me about 3 weeks to write this, and it's called Down But Not Out. All right. Thank you very much. That was a world premiere. Hopefully not the last time we play it. All right. That's some great solos here, guys. Having some fun. All right, now we're going to do a really nice arrangement by Henry Volking of a wonderful Irving Berlin tune called What'll I Do? You may have noticed we have two bass players. We have first base and second base. All right, yeah, all right, good. Second bad joke out of the way. No, and so we have to give the guys time to unplug and replug. And so we give them a moment here. I can hear it. All right. We good? All right. Aaron, thank you. All right. So you may have noticed that last tune, if you were tapping your foot, it didn't make sense in 4/4. That's because it was in 3/4. It was what we call a kind of a jazz waltz. We're going to do our last number here in a minute, but before we do, I'd like to thank you once again for coming out to join us on a Monday night. We do this every semester, and as I said, this is our 50th anniversary. And I've actually been directing this band for a little over half that time. It's kind of hard to believe. Yeah. Thank you. And these guys keep coming back. Now, you may have noticed there's some people who are a little more chronologically challenged than you might have expected for what you would think is a student jazz ensemble. But these are actually all students. Georgia State has a requirement that all of our classes are supported by paying students, or GSU 62. Some guys that are old enough in the state of Georgia can get free tuition. So all these guys have to register for Jazz Ensemble, and they even have to do some assignments, which are due Sunday, by the way, guys. Yeah, don't forget. So I'd like to introduce the guys real quickly. Before we play our last tune, I would like to thank our production staff. Before I do that, though, before I forget, our sound man Aaron Gottlieb up in the booth there, and our house manager Norman Richards, who's back here somewhere, floating around, and then our events coordinator, and her name is Sunny Vadrine, and we're very happy to have all these people supporting us every semester. So, real quickly, I'd like to introduce the guys in the band. Over on the piano, a wonderful jazz pianist, a hardware engineer by trade, Mark Tucker. And on guitar, you've heard some great solos tonight, some really wonderful stuff. A retired ophthalmologist, Dr. Jim Bedrick, on the guitar. And actually, Jim plays some rock and roll, too. He's got his own band called Brass Cats that you might hear around town at various times. Now, we've got several percussionists. Where's Richard? Is he hiding? Come here, Richard. Richard, come here. Are you still here, Richard? Come on, Richard. All right, well, there you are. You can't hide, Richard. So Richard Conley, this is his first time playing with us on vibraphone, and we're very happy to have him with us. Richard's been around the college for a long time, and I finally convinced him to play with us. He said, I've always wanted to play jazz vibes. And I said, okay, play jazz vibes. So he's here. Now we have two great drummers, a young man who was a Perimeter College student, graduated a couple of years ago, and is doing very well out in his business world, and his name is Jared Archibald, and we're so happy to have Jared back with us. And then a friend of mine I've known for over 40 years now. We actually played in a rock band together 40 years ago. It's hard to believe. That's how old we are. And Terry is actually, you make cabinets and stuff like that. He's a carpenter and does all that kind of stuff. And we're very happy to have him as one of our drummers, Terry Creedon, on drums and percussion. And now, we do have two bass players. And this young man right here is actually a Perimeter College music major, and he's doing a great job. He never played in a jazz ensemble before last semester, and he's doing such a great job. I'm very proud of him. Tyler Richardson right here. Right. And our other bass player, who was actually an accountant by day, but one of the best musicians in Atlanta, and he has several other groups that he plays with, Mr. Stephen Blair on the bass, upright bass. All right, now the saxophone section. We have, you just heard him, he actually is still in the law enforcement field, and as you heard, a great tenor saxophonist, Jeff Drew, here on the tenor. And then the anchor of the band, who's been here the whole time I have, a wonderful saxophonist. He's retired now and gets to do whatever he wants to, which apparently is not much, according to Bob. But anyway, we love him, and he's a great player. Bob Kemp on the alto sax. And as I mentioned, a good friend of mine who I played a lot with over the years, and we play in a rock band together ourselves, the Larry Griffith Band. And he's a wonderful musician, but he's also a professional pilot. And he's not doing that right now, but he has taught flying and was in the Air Force for a while. And is a great musician. You heard him on flute and alto sax. Steve Weichel, right here. And then we have a practicing dentist in our band. Oh, you retired? Oh, great. Okay. A formerly practicing dentist. Now he's practicing saxophone. And he also plays in our wind ensemble. This is Dr. Jeff Smith on the baritone saxophone. All right, now our brass department. We have an IT guy here who's been with us for several years, a really nice guy, and a wonderful trombonist, Nathaniel Addix on trombone. And I think he's the tallest guy in the band for sure. And this guy here, I've known for over 50 years, and a very dear friend. He and I, we went to different high schools together. He went to Peachtree High School, I went to Chambly High School, and we used to play in area bands together and even had our own big band together for a time with a bunch of high school players. There's a picture floating around on Facebook of that band somewhere. It's pretty hilarious. Anyway, my good friend Bob Devine on lead trombone. And last but not, and by the way, Bob was in the very first version of this band in 1975. So he's an original member that left for a while and then came back. Another original member over here on my right is a physician. He's an anesthesiologist and a very fine musician, Dr. Mark Merlin here. And I have to give a special shout out to Mark. He's not feeling well tonight. He probably would have been better to stay home, but he's such a trooper, he didn't want to let us down, so he came and played. So I'm really grateful that Mark, in his stamina, to come in here and play what's a fairly difficult program. So anyway, thank you so much for coming. We're going to end with a great tune by a wonderful LA-based composer and arranger named Tom Kubas, and this is a play on the Duke Ellington tune In a Mellow Tone. This is called In Your Mellophone. And a mellophone is actually a marching French horn, for those of you who don't know. All right. We'll see you at the end. That's all we got. We have some light. Norman, we need light. No problem, but you stayed calm, you got back on, that's all that matters. But you know what? So you learn from it. You learn from it.